Is China really taking over the world and winning the tariff saga? Or did President Trump just checkmate China? What's really happening? Hello, members, super savers, and bond course fans. I hope you're healthy and well, despite the crazy week we've just had in the markets and the ongoing tariff saga. The long-simmering U.S.-China trade war seems to have really gotten to a boiling point this week, with President Trump increasing tariffs on China to as much as 145%, and China retaliating with their own 125% tariffs on U.S. imports. And with Trump's reciprocal tariffs seemingly on pause right now for much of the rest of the world, everyone seems to be transfixed by the battle of the giants that pits the world's largest economy, the United States, as the world's reigning champion against the world's second largest economy, China, as the potential challenger for the title. I don't need to tell our community here how much markets are on edge right now, with more volatility and bad news coming practically every day. From CNN, a U.S.-China trade war could be catastrophic. What is Trump's endgame strategy? And on Friday, the University of Michigan's highly watched Index of Consumer Sentiment showed a reading of 50.8 for April, the second lowest level since the COVID-19 pandemic, and primarily driven by growing worries about trade war developments that have oscillated over the course of the year. And the top-of-mind question for many of us is, how will this end? Or, as Bloomberg phrases it, who will blink first in the U.S.-China trade war? Our Diamond NestEgg regulars know I'm fond of saying, I don't have a crystal ball. So let's do what we usually do on this channel and take a look at the facts that we have so far to see whether China or the U.S. holds the better cards, so to speak. Here are the three topics that we'll be covering in today's video. 1. How strong is China? 2. Did President Trump just checkmate China? And how might this play out? And 3. What are we doing differently with our money? As usual, here's a front of video disclaimer. For a detailed disclaimer, please refer to the end of this video. Let's dive in now, folks. How strong is China? So, the heart of the dilemma for China is that it is strong and weak at the same time. To answer the question of how strong is China, let's first talk about China's strengths. China dominates world manufacturing. 1/3 of all global manufacturing capacity is Chinese. Let me repeat, 1/3. If we look at this share of global manufacturing chart from the Wall Street Journal, this red line is China with its 1/3 share. That's more than the US, Japan, and Germany combined. And this manufacturing prowess has allowed China to become the most important trading nation in the world, as you can see here. The countries in red are the ones where China is a more important trading partner than the US. And the countries in blue are the ones where the US is a more important trading partner than China. And these blue countries are basically some of our neighbors in the Americas and our closest allies in Europe and around the Mediterranean. China's second strength is that it's moving up the economic value chain with their advances in artificial intelligence, such as with DeepSeek, which seemed to come out of nowhere earlier this year to shock Western markets. China is also getting better and better at building cars. Their cars seem to have impressed the author of this article. The author appears to have driven a bunch of Chinese cars and found them amazing. How China learned to build better cars while the West was sleeping. And China is also being praised by the World Economic Forum for helping to power the world's green transition. So China, the world champion in manufacturing and international trade, and a strong ongoing effort to move up the economic value chain. This brings us to China's third strength. China is no longer considered a third world country. It's actually quite impressive what China has achieved in the almost 40 years since Deng Xiaoping took power in 1976, in an impoverished country that was then basically on the brink of bankruptcy after the death of Mao Zedong. However, as so often in life, not everything that glitters is gold. Despite these strengths here and some of the pro-China headlines we've all been seeing in the news, China faces quite a few fundamental challenges of its own. So let's move on now to China's weaknesses. For starters, and probably the one issue that may be top of mind for Chinese President Xi Jinping when he thinks about the Chinese economy, is that China is experiencing quite a bad debt hangover from its years of breakneck growth and investment. What happened is that China did a lot of building during its phase of rapid growth. New highways, high-speed railway lines, new stadiums for the 2008 Beijing Olympics, you name it, they built it. And it all looks very impressive. But here's the problem. China took on a lot of debt to finance all this construction work. And now, maybe surprisingly for a number of folks, China is by some measures more indebted than the US or the Eurozone in relative terms. This red line shows China's overall debt as a percentage of GDP. Here's the US and here's the Eurozone. And what's even worse, it seems that they sometimes used all this debt to build a bit more than they actually needed. Bringing us to China's second big weakness. It's still suffering from the aftermath of the property bubble burst in the country after 2020. The Wall Street Journal estimated at the beginning of this year that up to 79 million housing units currently stand empty in China. That would be enough to house half the US population. British bank Barclays estimates that China's property meltdown has since 2021 destroyed around $18 trillion of Chinese household wealth, eclipsing the losses suffered by Americans in the financial crash of 2008-2009. Now, this loss of $18 trillion in household wealth would be equal to about a full year's economic output for China, and in relative terms, much worse than what the U.S. experienced in 2008-2009 during the Great Financial Crisis and its aftermath. And those of us who lived through it probably remember what a slog it was until we had it all worked out. And indeed, it seems that China is currently going through a similar slog, bringing us to its third weakness. China is experiencing deflation. CNBC reports that China is currently experiencing both consumer and producer price deflation, meaning prices falling over time instead of rising, which can be a sign of a struggling, even shrinking economy. One example would be the deflation in the US during the Great Depression of the 1930s. Add to all of this the well-known facts that China's birth rate is among the lowest in the world, and that its working age population has begun to shrink, and what you get is lower growth. Remember the days when newspapers were speculating about when China would overtake the US as the world's largest economy, and everyone who could was learning Mandarin? Well, the prospect of China's world domination seems now far out in the future, if it ever happens at all. Just have a look at this chart. This gray line represents the forecast from back in 2015 on when and by how much China's GDP would surpass our country's GDP in percentage terms. And had it come true, it would have happened by now. But those expectations were lowered in 2019 and once again in 2024. China's becoming number one appears to be looking less and less likely based on these numbers. Which of course brings us to the question of how is China trying to overcome its domestic slowdown? And how do other countries react? Forbes phrased it like this in April 2024. Beijing has decided it can export its way out of its economic problems. Substitute overseas sales of electric vehicles, EVs, and other green products for the shortfall in domestic Chinese demand for goods and services. Now, trying to increase exports when your domestic economy is in a slowdown or even crisis is neither unusual nor per se reprehensible. For example, that's what Ireland and Spain did after the Eurozone crisis of 2009-2010 hit them hard. And it worked. Both countries successfully pulled themselves up by their own bootstraps, as the saying goes. China has a problem that smaller countries like Ireland and Spain don't have, though. China is already such a large player in the export market that there's limited room for additional exports that other countries are willing to tolerate. most countries will stop excess foreign imports, in this case, excess Chinese imports, before they start destroying the industrial base in their own countries. And as Forbes predicted already a year ago, overall, the blowback on Chinese exports is impressive. Just since the start of the year, governments across the globe have announced more than 70 import-related measures against China, up from 50 in 2021 and 2022. Clearly, things will not go as they did 25 some years ago. This almost entirely export-driven model will fail. And 2025 doesn't look so different so far. As the New York Post reports, the European Union, Brazil, Mexico, and Thailand have either imposed new tariffs in the last few months or are considering such measures to protect their own industries from Chinese imports. And if we look at car exports, it seems that these countermeasures by potential destination countries have already begun to show some effect. Measured by value, Chinese exports of cars peaked in October 2023 and have not reached this level since. So, it may look like more weaknesses than strengths. An export strategy based on flooding the world market with cheap goods, plus trading partners who are imposing more and more tariffs on those goods because they're finally waking up to China's ultimate strategy. Doesn't sound like a lot of winning, at least not to me, which brings us nicely to the next section of today's video. Did President Trump just checkmate China, and how might this play out? So, it's really China's domestic economic weakness, its immense debt pile, the deflation, and lack of demand at home that currently seems to determine how it behaves in its international economic relations. To revive its sluggish economy, China has been building even more factories to employ the people who can't find property and construction jobs anymore. And these new factories then produce even more goods that China then wants to export all over the world because the domestic market is simply not able to absorb them. As we just discussed, many observers were a bit skeptical about the chances of success for the strategy in the first place. China may be just too big already to push even more exports into foreign markets. And that's why many countries have started to tariff, or in some cases, even outright limit imports from China. And if you look at it like that, then President Trump really has put China, maybe not in checkmate, but probably in a difficult position. His tariffs, both the initial rates and even more so the later escalations, will slow down exports to the U.S. at a time when China may have been counting on even more exports to overcome their slump. As per the last numbers, China's direct exports to the U.S. amounted to about $500 billion in 2023, or about 15% of their total exports. Add to that Chinese exports that reach the U.S. indirectly, for example, if they deliver components to Mexico or Canada that then end up in electronics or cars destined for the U.S., and that's an export volume that will be hard to replace by demand from other countries. It's not for a lack of trying, though. As PBS reports, China reaches out to other nations as Trump layers on tariffs. But it seems unlikely that too many other countries that may already be suffering from a wave of cheap Chinese imports themselves would try to lend China a helping hand by, let's say, opening up their own markets to even more Chinese imports. Australia, for one, has already turned down China's offer to join hands to fight U.S. tariffs. The reality is that many countries are currently busy building tariff walls of their own to protect their own domestic industry against what they may perceive as a flood of unfair Chinese competition. Plus, it probably doesn't hurt that Trump has paused country-specific higher tariffs for all other countries except China, and that the U.S. seems to be talking to most, if not all of them, to come to a deal, as the current administration would probably phrase it. So, for once, we find ourselves in agreement with how the British newspaper The Guardian phrases it. China needs friends in Trump's trade war, but she may have to go it alone. So where does that leave us, right? Well, we don't know either where this will go, and events are overtaking each other so fast, the uncertainty is even more extreme than normal. That said, Here are the three potential scenarios I have in my head. First, Trump and Xi engage in constructive negotiations and agree on a framework that allows China and the U.S. to remain trade friends. At the time of this taping, this is where things appear to be headed with many countries in Europe and Asia. And like with our European and Asian friends, compromises would need to be made on both sides, at least in our mind, meaning that this scenario would probably have to include promises by China to work on balancing out its trade with the U.S. somewhat, be it by opening up their own market a bit more to American products, or by voluntarily restricting some of their exports, or perhaps by moving some of their manufacturing to the U.S., maybe inspired by the deals that Japan struck with the U.S. in the 1980s in a somewhat similar situation. This may realistically be the best possible outcome from our current crisis that we can hope for, I think. But it's hard to predict how likely that is. After all, while such an agreement might improve the U.S. trade balance, it would most likely still reduce China's potential export volume to the U.S., as well as to their other trading partners, because these other trading partners may also seek concessions from China if the U.S. gets them, meaning that under this scenario, China couldn't just continue to export its way out of the slump, but would have to do something to generate more domestic demand from its own population, and we cannot be sure how feasible or acceptable that is to them. The second scenario is that both sides can't reach an agreement, and we get a full-out trade war. This would probably mean that the U.S. and China would mostly stop trading with each other, decouple as international trade professionals say. Such a decoupling might force every country in the world to pick a side as well, and we might see a return to two large trade blocs that are mostly self-sufficient and have only limited trade between each other. The world, if it came to this, might look as we had it during the Cold War, split between a West, led by the US, and an Eastern bloc, but led by China instead of the former Soviet Union. This would be very painful for both sides. China would probably sit on even more excess capacity than it already has, and its economic slump would get worse before it gets maybe better again at some point. And for the US, the transition would be painful as well, because it would take some time for us and or our trading partners who might aspire to replace China to build new factories and train the workers to build the goods that would replace what is currently coming from China. Plus, even once we've rebuilt our supply chains, computers, iPhones, toys, and many other household items may never be as cheap again. Now, this seems like the worst case scenario where both sides lose, and we really hope it won't come to bear. But we can't exclude it at this point, I'm afraid. We just don't know how this will end. And finally, the third scenario is something in between. Everyone pulls back from the brink, and we avoid an all-out trade war, but we don't get a new mutually agreed trade framework either. The two sides might still trade a bit with each other where it helps them, but at the same time, they would needle the other side whenever they see an opportunity. This scenario would probably see the U.S. imposing higher tariffs as well as more restrictions on imports from and technology exports to China, but also China restricting the export of some critical raw materials and components, as well as making life difficult for the many U.S. companies who manufacture and sell in China. This is maybe not ideal as an outcome, but I could see it happen as well. Who knows? President Trump's exemption of smartphones, other electronics from Chinese tariffs, announced on Friday evening, may be a step in the right direction. Drop a comment below. Which of these three scenarios do you think is most likely? Or do you have one in your head that you'd like to share with everyone? So, as I said, it's impossible for me to predict where this will all end. But here's the thing. Regardless of which of these scenarios prevail, in the end, it seems more likely than not to me that President Trump may get at least some of his higher tariffs under all three scenarios. And perhaps, more importantly, he may also have shown China that the world is not simply a dumping ground for cheap Chinese exports. Some of you are probably thinking, What's wrong with cheap Chinese products? And the answer is nothing. People who know me know that I love cheap stuff. In fact, generally speaking, and all else being equal, the cheaper the better. The problem with China and cheap is that China already controls a third of the world's manufacturing. And if this is the way they're behaving now, imagine what might happen when they control 50% of the world's manufacturing, or 60%, or even more. It is China who may be prepared to abuse the open arms and the friendship that the US and the West offered, not the other way around. From the Wall Street Journal, tools that Beijing has already used and is likely to expand include export controls of critical materials American companies use to make chips and defense-related products, regulatory investigations designed to intimidate and penalize U.S. companies, and blacklists intended to bar U.S. businesses from selling to China. In addition, authorities are preparing new ways to pressure American companies to give up their crown jewels, intellectual property, or lose access to the Chinese market. And no, it's not just American companies. The German train manufacturers had to hand over their intellectual property to the Chinese in order to get access to their market. So I don't watch Kevin O'Leary or MSNBC all too often. But in this case, O'Leary, who's actually advocating for 400% tariffs on China, by the way, sums it up well if you were to follow this line of thinking. Since China joined the WTO, the World Trade Organization, in 2000, they have not abided by the rules in any single year. There's no way you can figure out or settle a trade dispute with them. Although they said they'd agree to do that, they never did. They don't play by the rules. So many of us in this community talk about cutting government spending for future generations, or saving the climate for future generations. Well, stopping the flood of cheap Chinese imports and diversifying manufacturing capabilities beyond China, in my mind, may be something that we need to do for future generations if we want to protect and rebuild our industrial base. Now, I'm not going to get into how we got here with China's stronghold on manufacturing. That's a separate video series on its own. And there may be some good reasons and some less good reasons, but we are where we are now. And let me be clear, I dislike higher prices from this tariff saga. I dislike our equity holdings plummeting in the short term, and I dislike the market and economic uncertainty. But what I would hate even more is to put my kids and grandkids and your kids and grandkids in a situation where they might be even more reliant on China because we neglected to protect and rebuild our own industrial base. In any case, under any of the three scenarios that I have in my head, it's difficult to see how China would emerge as the only winner from the whole tariff situation. Every additional restriction on its exports would hurt them at home, and I can only keep my fingers crossed that that doesn't lead to more escalation that might spread to international politics and big power politics in a volatile geopolitical region that includes Taiwan. That does scare me, but at the same time, it's a wider geopolitical situation that you and I have no influence over. So let's talk a bit about what we can influence. What are we doing differently with our money? This answer may surprise some of you who are newer to us, and not surprise those of you who've been with us for a while. We're not doing much differently with our money. We still have cash parked in VUSXX, we're still laddering T-bills on the short end, and we're still dollar cost averaging into equities in our retirement accounts, because we still believe in America. I haven't bought any I-bonds yet this year, but I may pick up some before the end of this month. I need to do the I-bond versus tips video for all of you before I decide. I also nearly picked up some 5% 20-year T-bonds that we briefly saw in the secondary market this past week. But I wasn't quick enough in the end because I was busy posting about those 5% treasuries in our member zone. And for those of you who are interested in the crazy, or let's call it volatile, moves in treasury yields this past week, stay tuned for our next video, which I will link in the first pinned comment below as soon as it's ready. Hopefully that video will give you some more perspective on what we're seeing in the Treasury market and also shed some light on headlines like this one here. Bond analysts debate if China had role in Treasury swings. All right, members, super savers, and bond course fans, I hope you enjoyed this video and learned something new. And as always, if you want to learn more about how to build a stable, predictable income stream in times of market uncertainty and volatility, then check out this video here on our bond courses. And come join our next live member Q&A on Saturday, April 19th at 5 p.m. Eastern Time, 2 p.m. Pacific Time. We'll be diving deeper into the 2, 5, and 7-year T-note auctions and all things fixed income. I've also linked all the details on our bond courses and YouTube Super Saver membership below this video for your convenience. See you again very soon with more brand new wealth building content for your financial journey.